What happens when a black woman is kicked out of a hotel, only for everyone to find out she's actually the owner? The glass revolving door of the Vanderwell Imperial Hotel closed behind Aurora James, with a sound as soft as metal, letting out a sigh. She did not need flashy clothing, an entourage, or the ringing of welcome bells from the front desk. She was simply a black woman in a crisp white shirt, charcoal blue slacks, and simple black loafers, walking into a place where people assumed she did not belong. On her shoulder was an old leather bag, holding a phone, a wallet, and a black credit card that shimmered slightly under the chandelier light. Aurora stepped firmly across the cold marble floor, each step a quiet declaration that she had every right to be there. But in front of her stood a white man in a grey suit, Harrison Boyd, blocking the way like a living gate, his eyes barely masking his disdain. "I suggest you leave the lobby. This place is not for someone like you," he said, his voice not loud but cold enough to chill the air. It was not a careless comment. It was the language of a policy never written down but always enforced, deliberate and cruel. Aurora did not respond, did not lower her gaze. Inside her, an old wound stirred, like a memory of every time she had been rejected, underestimated. But she did not flinch. She simply reached, almost unconsciously, for her phone and typed a short message with just 2 words: 0 hour. Then she stood still. Her eyes did not look away, but held steady on the man who believed he had the authority to control this lobby. What he did not know was that in just a few minutes, he would be the one asked to leave the place he thought he ruled. Aurora approached the front desk, where 3 employees stood like marble statues, carved from the same block of prejudice. Fallon Pierce, the lobby supervisor, adjusted her makeup as if preparing for a courtroom where she always saw herself as the judge. Beside her was Dylan Hatch, a security officer in a black suit, his gaze sweeping over Aurora as if inspecting something that did not belong. No one smiled, no one greeted her. Only silence hung in the air like a noose tightening in the glow of the chandelier lights. Aurora placed her credit card and ID on the glass counter and said plainly, "I booked the penthouse. Name, Aurora James." The black card caught the light with a faint but unmistakable glimmer. Fallon did not touch it right away, only tilted her head as if examining a counterfeit bill in a corner store. "Are you sure you booked the right hotel?" she asked, her voice laced with both challenge and fake concern. Aurora said nothing, did not smile. She simply looked ahead, like someone who had heard that question more than once in her life. Dylan picked up the card with 2 fingers, as though it were a wet napkin. "Looks fake," he murmured, loud enough for everyone to hear. Fallon glanced at him, then silently pressed the red button beneath the counter, an internal alert for unauthorized guest attempting access to restricted floor. Aurora remained still, unfazed, not because she was unaware of what was happening, but because she knew exactly how systems like this revealed their true face. And that moment was coming. When Fallon pressed the alert button, a faint beep echoed through the internal system, audible only to those trained to recognize it. But on the surface, everything remained quiet, and that very silence became the sharpest weapon. In one corner of the lobby, Jalen Torres, a law student and young social justice activist, sat with his girlfriend. He sensed something was wrong the moment Aurora walked in. Not because of her appearance, but because no one asked if she needed help. Jalen opened his phone and started live streaming to the Justice Now group, where over 10,000 members were online. Beside him, Mei Lin, an Asian filmmaker specializing in documentaries, lifted her camera to her shoulder and whispered, "I'm filming this. People need to see." Neither of them looked away from Aurora, the woman standing still, yet far from fragile. Every raised eyebrow, every sideways glance from the front desk staff was recorded. Every suspicious whisper picked up and broadcast in real time. A couple nearby stopped their conversation and turned to watch. A young hotel staff member inside the elevator froze, her finger hovering over the buttons. The sense that something wrong was happening began to spread through the lobby, not with loud voices, but with silent glances. And amidst that quiet unraveling, Aurora still had not said a word. Because she knew this time she didn't need to speak for herself. The eyes around her were already speaking for her. At the edge of the front desk, Livia Cruz, the youngest receptionist at the hotel, stood frozen in place. She had witnessed many guests turned away simply for not looking on brand, but never once had she dared to speak up. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched Fallon lean in coldly to whisper in Dylan's ear, "Call the police if she doesn't leave." That sentence landed just as Livia met Aurora's gaze, a look not of pleading or anger, but one that seemed to ask, from deep within, "Will you stay silent again this time?" Livia swallowed hard. Her hands trembled, not out of fear of being fired, but because she knew she had hesitated for far too long. One step forward, and she moved to the front of the desk. Her voice was small but clear enough to cut through the air that had begun to simmer. I saw her name on the international VIP list. The booking account has a triple verification. There's no mistake." Harrison, who had been standing behind with his arms crossed like a gatekeeper, turned sharply, his voice tense with disbelief. "What did you just say?" he growled. Livia lifted her head. For the first time, she wasn't speaking to a guest. She was speaking to the very system that had trained her to look the other way. "I said I saw her name in the system. Clearly, it can't be wrong." The entire lobby fell silent, as if someone had pulled the plug. And Aurora, the woman who had just moments ago been treated as an intruder, smiled gently for the first time. Not because someone defended her, but because she knew. This was the moment when the balance began to shift. Livia's words fell like a drop of ink into a glass of clear water. Every gaze shifted instantly. Every movement seemed to slow in a space now thick with tension. Fallon glared at Livia, lips pressed tightly together, as if one more word would sever the last thread of restraint. Dylan, who had been standing behind the desk, stepped out, his hand on his radio, eyes sharp and ready. But Aurora remained still, standing as firmly as a tree rooted in the center of a storm. She lifted her hand to her ear and gently touched her wireless earpiece. "Kendall," she whispered, "switch to level 1. Lock the internal management system. Confirm image storage." On the other end, her discreet assistant, Kendall Moore, responded with just 2 words, "Understood." Aurora didn't need to raise her voice. After years of leading major corporations, she had learned one truth. Real power lies not in anger, but in preparation. Harrison was still unaware. He tried to assert dominance, speaking loudly to Fallon. "She's wasting the time of our other guests. Don't let a junior staffer stir up chaos." But around him, phones began to rise. Jalen continued live streaming. Mei Lin didn't lower her camera, and at the far end of the lobby, an elderly guest slowly stood up, tightening his grip on his cane. No one said a word. Yet it was that very silence, the silence of those who had seen enough, that was becoming a courtroom in plain sight. Aurora understood this, and inside her, an old door, one that had been slammed in her face many years ago, was now beginning to open. Fallon Pierce, clinging to a crumbling throne, stepped quickly out from behind the desk, her gaze sharp as steel. "This is my final warning," she said loudly, her voice echoing through the lobby. "If you don't leave right now, we will be forced to take action." Then, without waiting another second, Fallon reached out and touched Aurora's arm. It was just a light tap on the sleeve, but the air in the lobby seemed to freeze solid. Silence dropped like a curtain. Mei Lin's camera let out a sharp beep to signal it was recording. Jalen nearly shouted, "She just laid hands on a guest. We're live streaming. Nearly 9,000 people are watching right now." Every eye turned. Some guests began to whisper. A nearby African woman gasped. "I've seen this before, but never has anyone come back." Aurora didn't brush Fallon's hand away. She simply stepped back. And in that moment, the atmosphere tore open. Livia stepped out from behind the desk, her voice trembling but firm. "Guests are not to be touched. That is our policy." Fallon spun around, eyes blazing. "Say one more word and you're fired." But Livia didn't back down. She was no longer the timid employee who looked away. She looked at Fallon, then turned to Aurora. "I won't stay silent anymore. Today, I choose to stand with the truth." Aurora gave a slight nod, as if to acknowledge an unspoken truth. What was meant as an act of intimidation had become the spark that ignited a long, smoldering fire. And it had just erupted, right in the heart of a hotel built on power. The moment Fallon instinctively stepped back, still stunned and unable to react, Aurora raised her phone to her ear and spoke each word with a clarity that marked the beginning of an irreversible moment. "Kendall, initiate Phase 2. Disable access cards for Harrison Boyd, Fallon Pierce, and Dylan Hatch. Lock down all administrative privileges." A second later, like a cold blade slicing through the system, a series of short beeps echoed from the staff badges the three of them wore. A red message immediately appeared on the screen behind the front desk. "Access denied." Fallon stared at her badge as if she had slipped into a nightmare. Dylan, the man responsible for security, frantically tried again, but the system refused. Harrison's eyes widened as he tried to maintain a stoic face, though panic had already started to seep into his gaze. You don't have the authority to do this," he shouted, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Aurora didn't answer. Instead, she turned to Jalen and Mei Lin, both still recording, and calmly said, "Point the camera at the display case to the right. That's where they locked away my black card, as if it were evidence of a crime. But today, I'm not withdrawing a complaint. I'm withdrawing the entire system." At that moment, an elderly man stood up and called out, "I was thrown out of this place once, just because my wife wore a headscarf." A wave of murmurs rippled through the lobby. Aurora turned to Harrison once more. "You just made the biggest mistake of your career." And this time, there was no doubt in anyone's mind that everything had just changed forever. The lobby, once known for the kind of silence born from fear, now fell into a different kind of stillness. The silence of those who had endured too much for too long and were finally given the chance to speak. A brown-skinned woman in a simple faux fur coat stepped out from the waiting area, her gaze no longer avoiding Fallon's. "Last week, you told me my room had a technical issue," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "But I saw you hand that same key to the white man behind me." Fallon tried to respond, but her throat caught. Then a young lawyer in a blue suit, a regular guest, stepped forward. "Dylan told me to wait an extra 45 minutes because my room wasn't ready. But right after that, 3 white guests arrived and were checked in immediately." A murmur spread across the room. Each voice peeled away another layer of the illusion this so-called flawless system had carefully crafted. Aurora remained silent, simply standing there, letting the testimonies rise one after another. Livia stood beside her, gripping her hand tightly, feeling the shift in the air. This was no longer about one person being disrespected. This was about dozens, even hundreds of people who had been turned and toned away, labeled as not fitting the brand. And now, they were rewriting what it means to belong. Aurora took a step forward, her eyes meeting Harrison, Fallon, and Dylan, those who once believed power rested in their hands. But today, that power belonged to the very people they had tried to silence. And this time, they would not stay silent. In the whirlwind of rising voices, Aurora was suddenly pulled back to an afternoon when she was 17. She had worn her white school uniform, holding a stack of documents prepared for a scholarship presentation. She stood outside the Charlotte Plaza Hotel, where the event was being held. At that moment, all she asked was to enter and find her parents who were waiting inside. But the front desk clerk merely glanced at her uniform with disdain, then silently turned away and pressed the security call button. Aurora remembered standing frozen at the threshold, trying to smile and asking, "What did I do wrong?" No one answered. That young girl had walked away into the shadows, not filled with anger, but confused, unsure why her presence alone seemed to make others so uncomfortable. And today, standing in the lobby of the Vanderwell Imperial, a place that had stirred up that same memory, Aurora understood one thing clearly. She didn't need an apology. She needed a different ending. Returning to the present, she gently tapped her phone and said to Kendall, "Issue an internal alert. Suspend all hiring operations under Harrison Boyd. Begin a full review of every rejected application from the past 5 years." Harrison shouted, his voice sharp and frantic. "Who do you think you are? Just someone sitting in an office trying to run things on the ground. You'll bring this whole system down." Aurora looked up, her gaze cutting cold. If a system collapses just because one person tells the truth, then it should have fallen a long time ago. She didn't need more evidence. She was the living proof, the final conclusion no one had the courage to deny. The air in the hotel lobby felt electric, not from any device, but from the people who were just beginning to realize that the place once considered a symbol of privilege was now being redefined from within. Aurora turned to Livia, who still stood beside her like an unexpected pillar of strength. "I want you to run this hotel," she said, without any formality. Livia's eyes widened. Me? Aurora gave a slight nod, her voice calm but resolute. "Because I need someone with a heart brave enough to break the silence." Without delay, she turned toward the internal speaker system, pressed the button, and began speaking in a voice that didn't need to be loud to command absolute silence throughout the room. "My name is Aurora James, legal owner of the Vanderwell Imperial Hotel. Within the next 72 hours, the hotel will close for a complete restructuring. Every employee previously terminated for speaking up will be reinstated. Every complaint that was ignored will be reopened and investigated. An advisory board composed of guests who were once denied service will be formed to help rewrite our hospitality culture from the ground up." Fallon clutched her handbag as if it were her last shield. Harrison stepped back, his eyes adrift. Dylan lowered his head, hands trembling. But Aurora didn't look at them. She looked toward the ones who had been dismissed, overlooked, and turned away simply for not being the right fit. "Because hospitality doesn't begin with a smile," she said. "It begins with respect." And for the first time, the lobby didn't erupt in applause. It was silent, completely and reverently silent, as if the entire space had bowed to a transformation that could never be undone. 3 days later, when the Vanderwell Imperial Hotel reopened, Aurora did not walk through its doors like a victor. Instead, she stood across the street, quietly observing through the clear glass. Inside, Livia, now the general manager, was gently guiding an elderly woman toward the elevator, holding her hand with care. In the lounge, once reserved for VIP guests, a young brown-skinned boy sat reading a book, undisturbed, with no one asking his name or looking at him like he didn't belong. There were no security glances, no receptionists pressing a button to call management. Aurora smiled softly, not because she had gained power, but because she had opened a door that people like her were once denied. In the lobby, the gold nameplates had been replaced by handcrafted wooden signs, engraved with raised letters and sign language symbols so anyone could read them. The VIP recognition system was no longer based on spending, but on how guests treated the service staff, the room attendants, the porters, the doormen. And the room Aurora had once been denied now bore a small sign on its door. "The place that once turned away someone who belonged will turn no one away again." Livia no longer wore a name tag. She had once said, "If I need a name tag to earn respect, then the culture here still isn't good enough." Every morning, she greeted each staff member by name and asked, "What do you need today to be better than yesterday?" Aurora turned away, leaving the corner behind. She no longer needed to stand in the lobby to be acknowledged, because what she had left behind was not a victory. It was a new value system, one where everyone is allowed to walk in, not because they resemble someone else, but because they deserve to be wholly themselves. That afternoon, sunlight stretched across the sidewalk in front of the Vanderwell Imperial Hotel. Aurora paused at the street corner, one hand in her coat pocket, the other holding a softly vibrating phone. On the other end, Kendall reported, "Feedback is pouring in from nationwide branches. Hundreds of employees are requesting to resubmit their applications." And Aurora, the live stream has surpassed 90,000 views. But she did not respond right away. From across the street, she saw a young, brown-skinned woman approach the front desk. In her hand was an old suitcase. Her jeans were frayed at the knees, and her eyes still held a trace of worry. But Livia did not ask her name first. She smiled, stepped out from behind the desk, and greeted her with the warmth of body language alone. No scanning glances, no silent questions assessing her status. And Aurora knew then the change had started to take root. She once believed that the day Harrison Boyd ripped off his name tag and shouted in the lobby was the end of a tragedy. But in truth, it was only the closing line of an era that needed to end. The real ending was here, where a brown-skinned boy is no longer asked, "Who are you waiting for?" Where an elderly woman in a headscarf is not told to step aside. Where a front desk clerk can speak the truth without fearing for their job. Aurora remembered herself at 16, standing outside the Charlotte Plaza Hotel, holding a book and waiting for her parents. Back then, a woman in an expensive suit had looked her up and down and asked, "Are you sure you're in the right place?" Today, if she could speak to that girl again, Aurora would say, "You weren't wrong. You just needed to live long enough to rewrite the ending." No applause needed, no stage required, because justice does not arrive with noise. It arrives with presence. And today, Aurora was present, not to take up space, but to open the door, for everyone who was once held outside. The door is now open, and no one has to ask, "Am I allowed in?" anymore. In today's society, where power is often displayed through keycards and judgmental glances, the story of Aurora James stands as a clear testament that the right presence, at the right time, and the right kind of silence can be more powerful than any declaration. She didn't shout, didn't fight with anger, but chose to stand firmly in the truth. And it was that choice that caused an entire system, once thought unchangeable, to begin to shake and collapse from within. From a guest denied entry, Aurora rebuilt an entire culture of service based on respect instead of artificial standards. This is not just a story about a hotel. It is a story about a principle. That justice is not something handed out. It is something reclaimed with dignity. As storytellers, we do not believe what Aurora did was extraordinary. We believe it was what should have always been ordinary. But in a world still filled with invisible barriers, that very ordinariness becomes an act of courage. And perhaps the most profound thing she left behind was not a lesson in ethics, but a quiet question that touches each of us. What will you stand beside when no one is watching? If you believe that justice does not need permission to exist, like this video and subscribe to keep following stories like this, where truth does not need a microphone to be heard. And if you've ever been doubted, ever been dismissed just for being who you are, leave a comment below with the words, "I am here." Because sometimes those 3 words are enough to let us know that you are not alone. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We'll see you in the next story, where even a single look can change an entire world.